Hello, I'm David Allen, and I'm going to talk to you today about incentivising management on private equity transactions. Different sponsors use a number of different structures to incentivise management. On Western European buyouts, by far the most common structure is what's known as the sweet equity structure, and that effectively involves splitting the equity into ordinary equity and preferred equity. The preferred equity has a fixed return, so it's really like a debt-like instrument. The sponsor will make its investment into the preferred and the ordinary equity, and then will invite management to participate in the ordinary equity and possibly also the preferred. And management will effectively be given a different ratio in which they would invest, such that if the ordinary equity performs, management will be receiving a greater return on every dollar that they've invested. That is often tax efficient because management would be paying fair market value at the beginning of their investment for their securities. And another form of structure that is often commonly seen is what's known as ratchets or hurdle shares. They're often much more complex to structure. And effectively, a ratchet is a means of giving management a greater share of the equity if the sponsor were to achieve a particular return. And then finally, there are some of the more cash-based schemes such as share options and warrants, bonuses, phantom schemes, those sorts of things. They're often very helpful for incentivising middle-level management, and they provide with them much greater flexibility, but often they're not particularly tax efficient and result in management being taxed on an income tax basis. And similarly, management don't really have any skin in the game in those types of structures. Management are key not only on the operational side, but also really in driving a successful exit event. And because of that, management won't really be given a liquidity right before an exit. They will really be in the game until the private equity sponsor achieves its own exit, and management would tag along on that transaction. In terms of the exit itself, because the private equity sponsor will be looking to avoid giving any business warranties, they will often turn to the management team to give those business warranties, because it's the management team that have the knowledge about the operational aspects of the business. But those warranties are different to typical risk allocation warranties, and they would typically be qualified by awareness and subject to quite low caps on liability. And similarly, in respect of an IPO, the sponsor's preferred position would be to avoid any form of lockup, whereas management would typically be subject to the underwriter's lockup of 6 to 12 months. When a manager ceases to be involved in the business, he effectively becomes a leaver. And this is probably one of the areas that is most hotly negotiated in the management equity documents. We'd normally expect for there to be two different categories of leavers: a good leaver who would receive market value for their equity when they leave, and a bad leaver who would receive the lower of cost and fair market value at the date of departure. The definitions of good leaver and bad leaver often have a lot of detail in them, and as I said, are heavily negotiated. So people would tend to agree that a manager who ceases employment due to death or ill health or reaching a statutory retirement age should be a good leaver, whereas a manager who is dismissed for gross misconduct such as fraud would be a bad leaver. And then in between those categories, there are often shades of grey, either areas that need to be clearly defined, such as poor performance, or areas that perhaps are more hotly contested, such as whether resignation after a particular time period could ever constitute a good leaver event. The leaver provisions really are an option for the sponsor. They're not really a liquidity right for management, so the sponsor decides whether or not to invoke them. Similarly, the sponsor will often be looking for flexibility to settle a leaver's consideration either in cash or in loan notes. It may prefer the loan note structure because with cash it would have to source that cash from effectively its fund, and it would often want to avoid having to make any drawdown. The leaver provisions can be a useful mechanism to ensure that management comply with non-competes. Typically there's a lag time in which they're invoked, so a sponsor may want to wait and see whether a manager complies with his non-compete provisions before invoking them, and were he to breach those provisions, then he would be classified as a bad leaver. And then finally, one of the things we're seeing more recently on deals is management looking for a form of downside protection, which is effectively a floor on the leaver price for a good leaver at the cost they paid. That concludes my presentation. If anyone has any questions, then they should feel free to contact me, David Allen, at Baker McKenzie.